Hello and welcome to this panel on Australian jazz. My name is Jane Cornwell and I would like to acknowledge elders past and present who may be watching this panel. I'm on Boonwurrung country today. I'm a Melbourne-born writer and journalist, and I've been in London for almost 3 decades, where I'm a jazz critic for the London Evening Standard and a writer for Jazzwise magazine. And I write about jazz for newspapers in Australia, including the Weekend Australian Review, and chair panels at events such as the EFG London Jazz Festival. And with me today to chat about the state, the rude health of Australian jazz, which is fresh, high quality, diverse, of international standard, and we're going to be talking about Australian jazz on the global stage, are 3 high caliber representatives. So in alphabetical order, we have Hadley Agrez, who is the CEO and Program Director of the Melbourne International Jazz Festival, a man with a wealth of experience in large-scale festival delivery and a particular interest in artist development in a festival context. We have the incredible multi-award-winning improvising pianist-composer Andrea Keller, a recording artist, performer, educator, collaborator, lecturer, and might we say a visionary. And there she is with her piano behind her. Last year in lockdown here in Melbourne, Andrea released 4 albums, including Life is Brutiful with her band Five Below. And I found a quote about Andrea that a critic had said that her music is like, it conjures an image of angels dancing on a pinhead. Because of the way Andrea toys with dimensions and perspectives of sound. So I love that. So welcome, Andrea.
Thank you.
And we have the ever astounding saxophonist Jeremy Rose, whose multifaceted, multi-award-winning career embraces dozens of original music releases involving collaborative and solo projects, including the Ear Shift Orchestra, Jeremy Rose Quartet, and the Vampires, whose 2017 collaboration with Beninwa guitarist Lionel Lueke won international plaudits, including, I must say, by myself in the London Evening Standard. I absolutely love that album. Jeremy's toured Europe with American guitarist Kurt Rosenwinkel, also with Lionel Lueke. He is the label director of Ear Shift Music. And with this indie label has fostered a community of musicians who are pushing to sort of redefine definitions of jazz. His latest project premiered or was presented at the Sydney Festival in January. It's called Disruption, The Voice of Drums, and that was with the Ear Shift Orchestra. So welcome to all 3 of you here at this Jazzahead panel. You're all major voices and players in Australian jazz, and I love the fact you're all invested in emerging artists in the kind of jazz of tomorrow. So I suppose my first question to all 3 of you is, how healthy is Australian jazz and how healthy are its audiences? Because clearly one begets the other. So maybe let's start with you, Hadley, from a kind of festival perspective.
Sure. Look, the short answer, Jane, is very healthy, in my opinion. And I think, look, we're at a really interesting time for us at the moment, fingers crossed, post-pandemic life, where I think, from an audience point of view, there seems to be more enthusiasm for domestic work than I've seen, possibly in as long as I can remember. I'm sure the others are sort of nodding and agreeing, which I think is great. From a purely festival point of view, we're in a position this year where we, going to push ahead with our festival in October, and we will have almost an entirely domestic focus. And it's a real chance for us to, firstly be excited about that and the work that's been coming out, but also to champion the work to these audiences that at the moment, like I said, more so than ever, are sort of hungry to see new work and to and old work, and just to, I guess also partly by finally being allowed out of their homes, but just to go and consume culture, I think, broadly. Mm-hmm. So it's an exciting time.
Sure. Andrea, what's your view?
Well, from a musician's point of view, and in terms of the musicians that are part of this scene. I think it's incredibly healthy as well. I live in Melbourne, and we have a pretty healthy jazz club scene, so there's opportunities for live performance, which certainly when things opened up for us post 2 lockdowns down here in Melbourne, the audiences were so appreciative, and all the nights were sold out to capacity. When I say capacity, COVID capacity, which was really exciting, because I think in those lockdowns people really came to realise how much they love live music, and I had a lot of people communicating with me about that. Normally I find it really exciting at festival times, because the audiences are so massive and they're people that I've never seen before. So I think that's one of the wonderful things about festivals, and perhaps because of this experience with COVID and the more successful jazz festivals we have, hopefully those people will start coming more regularly to small gigs. And because often I do regular Monday nights, say at the Jazz Lab, and that has a nice following of faithful fans. But it's
being a venue in Brunswick in Melbourne, is that right?
Correct. Yeah, correct. But it's been nice to see different people coming down and experiencing the club and getting to know the musicians and what's going on and how creative our scene is here.
What do you think, Jeremy? Let's just take COVID out of the equation. Do you feel that Australian jazz has got enough of a sort of global standing? Is there enough going on here? I mean, certainly COVID perhaps is making us look back to our own, but how do you feel the state of Australian jazz was without COVID, prior to COVID?
I think Australian jazz really has can stand on its own 2 feet on the international stage. I think despite our distance from the Northern Hemisphere, I think we really are creating unique individual voices here, and I think there's a really strong legacy of artists and a community of unique creative bands and ensembles. We don't have to look much further to groups such as the Necks and drummer Simon Barker and numerous musicians that have really made a strong presence on the international scene. I think, the silver lining of the pandemic has been that the major presenters have been looking to our local artists who have, I think there's going to be a real community resurgence and outpouring of new works once we finally see the dust settle from this difficult period. I think it's things looking up.
Well, let's talk a little bit about, and I'm interested because I've lived in London for so long and I've written a lot about, the London jazz scene. I mean, people there are very reluctant to call it a scene, but let's say, community. But there does seem to be a kind of feeling that there is a kind of sceneness in Chicago or in Los Angeles and in London, even Bombay and Bogota. There are these kind of thriving jazz communities. Do you get a sense, Hadley, that that's happening? I mean, I perhaps wonder if it's happening in Melbourne more than Sydney, but what do you think?
Yeah, look, I think it definitely is. I mean, I'll let Jeremy speak better to Sydney, but certainly down in Melbourne, there is a really strong scene, and I think the word community is a good word for it down here in Melbourne. And I say that because there's such support from particularly within the artistic community for one another and supporting each other's work and starting new collaborations and new projects. I think there's also great support from venues and audiences as well, but it really does feel like a community here, and I think you can see that in the work that comes together. In particular, some of the oh, apologies, I've got an echo here in the room. I'll just try and knock that out.
Okay, don't worry. Let's go to Andrea. What do you think, Andrea? Because, I mean, it's also interesting, I think, that that certainly, again, with some of these things, that the young players are really kind of incorporating their sort of diasporic identities within the music they're playing. So there's sort of a lot of Ghanaian music now within jazz. There's certainly Afrobeat, which I know, Jeremy, you've referenced in your music, and you know, all sorts of what used to be called world music. You know, we don't say world music anymore, but you know, these kind of different sounds that I think that, you know, what's interesting is that proves this notion of jazz as a kind of living music, you know, and jazz is able to absorb all these new traits and still maintain its identity, which is why it will never be dead, you know. All this stuff about jazz is dead, no, it just will keep coming up. But what do you think, Andrew, in terms of how are Australians, or this Australian community, are they absorbing new influences?
Oh, definitely. And I think we sort of have to. I mean, we're listening to a lot of diverse music. So much music is available to all of us now. The access is really quite easy, and so we're listening to a lot of diverse music. And because we're creative musicians and we really focus on things like collaboration and finding your own voice, and you know, creating original music that is heavily relies on improvisation, and those are all of the things that are meaningful to me, and I know a lot of my colleagues in the jazz scene in Melbourne and the broader Australia. Because of that, of course, those influences are going to come out in the music, and something that I find here in Melbourne where I live is that there's a lot of different groups of improvisers, or a lot of different groups in the scene. You know, there's a very heavy free improvisation sort of component to the scene, and then there's a heavy original jazz, but composed slash improvised part to the scene. And then there's more of a traditional jazz scene, but with a very youthful contemporary slant on it, and you know, probably a lot of other groups as well. But they all do talk to each other.
Jazz side, weren't you, as well? There's like the 3070 collective, which I know Giles Peterson championed quite heavily. Have that spiritual side. Go on.
Yeah. But people do move between them, which I think is also a really lovely thing. And maybe it has something to do with the fact that we are so separated from the Northern Hemisphere, and we're very much on our own here. And so people do move very freely between a lot of those different groups, which I find really liberating as a musician, to know that I can collaborate with lots of different musicians.
That's interesting. Or could that be because a lot of these musicians went to similar conservatoires and kind of knew each other from there, and kind of, yeah, with a lot of these jazz incubators will swap between different groups, and
yeah, quite definitely. I think in Melbourne we can attribute a lot of the creativity and the original voices in our community to Brian Brown, who headed the Jazz and Improvisation course at University of Melbourne, which was Victorian College of the Arts back in the day. And Sorry?
You teach there now, is that right?
Yes, I'm very fortunate to be a lecturer there in the Jazz and Improvisation course. And the philosophy still remains that of that we are Australian. You know, in my case, going to study there, it was so liberating and unexpected for me to have someone say to me, "You're Australian, you're a woman of migrant parents. I grew up playing classical music and loving that." And for someone to say to me, all of that is valid and you can bring all of that to your jazz and improvised voice.
Your parents being from Czechoslovakia. What was Czechoslovakia originally? That's right. Yeah. Jeremy, I'm interested in just talking again about this notion of absorbing different influences and how Australian musicians are doing that. And you did a quite phenomenal project called Iron in the Blood, which was inspired by Robert Hughes' Fatal Shore, and had a 17-piece orchestra and projections, and certainly a lot of cross art form presentation, and it was compared to things like Max Roach's Freedom Suite and Wynton Marsalis, who actually was inspired by the Fatal Shore for something, wasn't he? But lots of incredible acclaim and accolades. And let's talk a little bit about that and how that particularly Australian kind of content informed jazz, because it's quite a brave thing to do, I think.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of it stems back to the fact that Australia itself is an improvisation, which is a borrowed term from Paul Grabowski. But Australians were forced to improvise from the get-go when European settlers arrived here, and that has bred a culture that's kind of inherent in the musicians here of developing our own way of doing things. And I think Australia, we didn't have such a large African American diaspora settle here as they did in parts of non-American regions, such as in Western Europe and other places. So the musicians, I think their creative processes here are really informed by the Australian tropes of what the Australian character is, and that might be our larrikinism, or our general black sense of humour. And
how would we describe larrikinism to our European friends? What would we say there?
Being a joker, self-deprecation is
tough party. Yeah, true.
A lot of swearing. And perhaps drinking. But it's a pretty unforgiving climate and landscaping in Australia. This sense of space and timelessness. And ideas that are really rich and borrowed from Australia's Indigenous population, which is a strong connection to the land. And I think that definitely has informed a lot of the musicians here. I mean, I've already referenced the Necks, but one way to perceive their music is just driving across an endless landscape in Australia. Definitely this sense of slowly unfolding, slowly changing nature.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I was as you mentioned, I did read that Winter Marsalis was in fact inspired by reading The Fatal Shore. So I thought I certainly need to address this and do it from an Australian colonial perspective.
Fatal Shore being, just again for our European friends, a sort of classic tone that really addressed white settlement in Australia, and treatment of Indigenous population, which has been a very problematic issue for white Australia.
Yeah. So I think some of the sort of key ideas about how to generalise the Australian jazz scene are that in general it's very eclectic. As Andrew already mentioned, there's everything from free improvisation to music that's strongly influenced by Oz rock. You're going to hear jazz that's informed by bluegrass and prog rock, and I guess it also reflects our pluralistic and multicultural society here in Australia. So I don't think there's one particularly defining sonic element, but perhaps you might be able to tie something together to the processes, and that might be informed by our culture.
So it's interesting, isn't it? Because actually when you think about jazz, and it is music of black origin, but it's certainly music of political origin, just because of because of its where it's come from. But do you find that there, and certainly going back to I'm sticking just on The Fatal Shore, that is a sort of, whether you like it or not, politically loaded kind of work. Do you find that musicians, and I'll ask all three of you, do you find that musicians are addressing politics through their music?
Yeah, I think traditionally jazz has been a music of protest. We already talked about Max Roach's Freedom Suite, and in the civil rights period of the States, jazz became almost a weapon, and a weapon for protest. So I think here it also serves musicians that have a greater agenda of trying to decolonialize and decentralize some of the traditional structures of Western art music. And I think because it is an improvised form, it is so adaptable to various means and objectives.
Well, it's interesting. I just saw, I was saying to Andrea earlier, I just saw a piece called Wata with the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra, and you mentioned Paul Grabowski, who's a multi-award-winning jazz pianist and composer here who wrote this with the Australian Art Orchestra, who Andrea is a erstwhile member of. But they had two Indigenous performers with them, and it was sort of a merging, not a marriage, but a merging of Indigenous Australia, these thousands-year-old, this very, very old art form with classical music. And it seems to be something, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to be something that Australia is, or the Australian music industry or the Australian music scene is doing a little bit more of, is merging the Indigenous with the classical, with the jazz, and this kind of cross-genre performances. Hadley, maybe you want to comment on that. I mean, I'm interested in that, and I'm interested in whether Melbourne International Jazz Festival would commission something large-scale like this.
Yeah, look, I mean, I was at the same performance and it was fabulous to see. I think there is a lot of momentum in Australia broadly behind encouraging greater representation from First Nations artists across the board, not just in jazz and improvised music, which is great, probably long overdue, but nonetheless, at least there are significant strides currently underway. And I think, as Jeremy was mentioning, jazz is a great vehicle, I think, for some of that expression, particularly because it's in its legacy, as you said, Jeremy, it's sort of been a vehicle for kind of marginalised voices, and these sort of provides a context for those kind of discussions and that art to be at the front. So performances like Water are a great example of where that can come through. That wasn't an inherently political work, but I think there's great scope for more and more of that here in Australia. And in terms of developing our jazz identity, which, as the others have said, is strong and broad and diverse, but, we continue to develop as any art form and as any identity does. So I like to think that First Peoples' voices will be even more present, particularly in jazz. And in terms of what the festival's doing in this space, I think it's something we want to move further and further into. What we've noticed broadly is that there's probably some representational deficiencies within that community, and access to jazz as an art form, and access to, in some cases, to sort of the major tertiary institutions and other things. So we're looking, from a festival point of view, at starting artist development programs, targeting emerging and mid-career artists, and really providing platforms and support where we can. And we'll be launching one of those programs in a couple of weeks here. So it's very exciting at our end. And hopefully then, that momentum can continue to build through those sort of projects and Jeremy's work and other Paul's as well, and what's going on in the
Your festival is going live, isn't it? It's not online. It's October, is that right?
Oh, I hope it will be live. At this stage, we are moving towards the live festival. Yes.
Fantastic. Well. I mean, we're the kind of envy of the world in that sense, Andrew, I'd like to talk a little bit about jazz education, because I think it's interesting. It does seem to be, and Jeremy as well, I think it's, can be different according to countries. Certainly Britain, there are the conservatoires, and there just seems to be a freedom that once one graduates, you're free to explore. It seems to me that in America, it's a little bit more traditional. You wouldn't think so, but then after you learn the sort of the Great American Songbook, then you might do an album to prove your chops, and then you can go out and, I'm thinking of the sort of Kamasi Washingtons and the Kendrick Lamars, they'll all, and Christian Scotts, they'll go and do a traditional album and then go off and explore this stuff. In terms of Australia, how adventurous are our graduates, and how encouraged are they, or how encouraged are musicians or jazz musicians to find their own voice early on? Do you want to take that one, Andrea, first?
Sure. Well, as I said, in the sort of the longest running jazz course in Melbourne, certainly finding your own voice has been an enormous part of the philosophy. In fact, it's been the main focal point of the philosophy. So definitely musicians are encouraged to be adventurous. I remember my first album that I put out in 2000. I then went overseas and was meeting other musicians and playing with musicians, and actually a musician in Scotland said, it's almost like that first album, that should be like your fifth album, you know, and I think what he was meaning was it's so adventurous that it sort of feels uneasy to be a first album. But I think, you know, for me, I was certainly really lucky, and I know that this happens to a lot of musicians here, with the ABC having programs where they record young artists or emerging artists who are doing original music, original jazz, and they provide an opportunity for them to record for broadcast on the ABC, and then there's often, you know, options to buy the license and put out recordings. So certainly for me, the first few recordings I did were facilitated through that program at ABC Jazz Track, and you know, and of course going for grants and all of that, there was, and I still feel there really is, a focus on being adventurous and having personal expression at the core of what you're doing, and perhaps being political or, you know, being inclusive and very collaborative. I think we really value that here, and that's what really facilitates this adventurous spirit in us.
It's kind of interesting to see or to hear perhaps what take international jazz colleagues of yours have in terms of how do they perceive Australian music. But Jeremy, I was going to ask you the same question as I asked Andrea in terms of conservatoires. What's your take there?
Yeah, I think you know, students they learn a lot from themselves these days as well. You know, never before has a generation been or had access to the entire recorded history of music, as well as the all the instructional videos on how to perform in every style of music. So I think we're finding this real agency in students to be self-didactic and you know, to form their own bands and write their own music. And I think you know, there is a saying that if you locked all the students up in the library or in the rehearsal room, you'd probably come out with similar results. But having said that, I think there's a fantastic cultural of mentorship. You know, there's quite a few bands and musicians in Australia that work with younger generations. Andrea Keller being one of them, and I think that's a really, you know, important way to pass the torch on to the next generation. There's also some fantastic programs for fostering the younger musicians, such as there's a Women in Jazz program here in Sydney. There are awards such as the Freedom Fellowship and the National Jazz Awards, and numerous commissioning projects from our national broadcaster, the ABC. So yeah, and in terms of being adventurous, I think that's part of the culture of, you know, rule breaking and really trying to, you know, I know that when I got out of studying the conservatorium, I just wanted to play anything but standard jazz repertoire. So, you know, I think there's a bit of culture in that, in wanting to write out my own music. So
I'm interested to know how much you think it's changed over the years, because certainly in London, over the years, have met a couple of Australian jazz musicians who said they didn't feel they could go as far as they wanted to go. In Australia. My sense now, Jazzwise have asked me to write a 1,800-word article on Australian jazz because they just keep hearing how healthy it is. The Australians just commissioned me to write a piece on, oh gosh, her name, Linda May, on yes, thank you.
Linda May Hanno.
Thank you. Yes, you know, and so and certainly, you know, as you say, the necks, and you know, it's well, it's endless rather than kind of name checking. But do you feel it's changed, Hadley, that the Australian jazz, there's a marked, there was a turning point or a sea change, that suddenly it was okay for Australian, again taking COVID out, that where Australians could actually felt comfortable enough being at home, not having to go and live overseas to get a profile?
Yes and no, I would say. Again, I'm not like the others in this room, not a working musician. I feel like there are loads of opportunities, and as we said, there's a really receptive audience. I do feel like for the most part, musicians here have to supplement their work with whether that's teaching or other avenues. We've got a relatively strong funding environment, which really does help in many cases, but I wouldn't say it's the be all and end all. That said, I think there's still the lure of, again, taking COVID out of it, the lure of touring and the lure of accessing international markets is still strong. Where we don't have the same audience potential, say, as Japan or the States, obviously, or Europe. So I think I feel like that still underlies some of the scene, but I do think there's been some real success. As you say, with Linda and on another band entirely, bands like Hiatus Coyote that are on that sort of neo-soul crossover tip that are doing incredibly well abroad. So I think, a little bit of both is probably how I'd respond.
Okay. Andrea, what do you think?
Can you come back to me?
Well, and Jeremy, do you feel like, it's okay to sort of be an Australian jazzer at heart, COVID let's take the C word out. Do you feel that Australian musicians are happier these days to stick around at home rather than having to seek fame overseas?
Yeah, I think there's a general confidence in who we are and what we have to offer. And in many respects, there are also musicians that don't give a rat's ass what else is going on around the world. They're just they're enjoying the process of creation here and creating some really interesting identities, and in turn that's getting recognised internationally. Having said that, I think yes, to develop your profile in your home country, it is unfortunately it's advantageous to build recognition abroad, and I think that could be said for any country around the world. They say if you make it overseas, it's definitely going to help you sell tickets back home, and there's a precedent of that anywhere. And I've noticed that through my own projects and having toured internationally and getting more international reviews and recognition. That's definitely helped. So,
but certainly ways around that are what you've done in a sense, which you've done these international collaborations. So that's interesting. Do you see that you as with the Vampires, your quartet, you collaborated with Lionel Lueke. Do you see something like international collaborations as a way to perhaps stay grounded in Australia, but, just have a kind of more of a flow between across the world?
Yeah, certainly. And similarly for artists that are trying to gain access to the Australian market. And I know there might be quite a few viewers out there that are interested in this sort of thing. So I think, artistic exchange is really sort of key to sort of getting a foothold in the Australian jazz scene. And I think that there's a lot of potentially great artistic outcomes that can come from that, both for both collaborators, but also it definitely helps to have a grassroots an artist on the ground who knows the way of the land here, and knows some of the what are the best venues to be performing at and the best time periods to be touring. It is possible for international groups or international solo artists to come here and build touring networks. And other examples of this, Jamie Ollers has worked with Eric Harlan, Ruben Rogers. I know Jason Moran has come and performed with Simon Barker and Scott Tinkler. Joe Lovano's performed with Paul Grabowski. Mulatu Starkey
comes down and picks up with the Black Jesus Experience, and all these things.
Yeah. So there's a long history of artists collaborating with Australian bands. So so I think that's a great way to get here.
Oh, absolutely. And certainly a lot of the British jazzers that I speak to that have toured Australia, one thing that really strikes me is that they don't just like touring Australia, they love touring Australia. There's something about the audiences, the festivals, the enthusiasm, and I think that's shouldn't be disregarded. It does make Australia kind of stand out. There is a real hunger, as you say, in market, and not just because we've been denied it lately. I think that, certainly, if you're going to be cheered and danced to and applauded and, all those kind of things. Do you find that, Hadley, that maybe international artists that have played the Melbourne Jazz Festival have said, wow, you've got a really healthy jazz ecosystem here?
Yeah, actually we do. And I think it comes as a surprise often because we are just a long way away from the rest of the world. And that's one of our challenges as a festival is, bringing people here. But as you sort of suggest, once people are here, they are really pleasantly surprised, I think, by the strength of the scene, the musicians, the community, as we said before. And from those times, a lot of collaborations do develop based on that and based on those visits, which is really encouraging. I think also what surprises some international artists and our guests when they come is that there are viable kind of touring networks, especially at particular times of years, really to build into one's kind of tour routing or plans, sort of 2-year plans, and plans around releases and then potential collaborations. And we, as a festival, we spend a lot of our time in a typical year really facilitating those tours so that many artists that do come over make our festival one of the largest stops on a sort of 4 or 5 city tour. And we've got a really great network of partners and presenters here on this side of the world. And we work closely together because we're all aware of the difficulty of the tyranny of distance, as they say.
Tyranny of distance, indeed. And jazz is a genre that's so important to see live. And Andrew, improvisation again is even more important to such a live phenomenon. And I'm kind of interested in the way that somehow that is also, and Jeremy, you as well, has with the necks, with what you do, Andrew, and you're such a sort of brave performer with your prepared pianos and your improvisations. And what is it about, we've maybe touched on this, but let's try again, about improvisation and Australian musicians, because there is a real willingness to embrace improv.
I suppose I can only really speak personally on this. But for me, I mentioned earlier that I grew up playing classical music as a child, was learning classical music and really loved listening to it, genuinely, have an incredible amount of respect and admiration for composers, that I was studying and listening to. But when I started listening to jazz as a teenager, the first thing that struck me, actually I think it was a whole little box of things that struck me that totally won me over. One was the communication of the people on stage between each other, the freedom with which they were able to communicate with each other, verbally and musically, the dialogue that was going on, and also the sense of groove and the sense of spontaneity and risk-taking, which I found absolutely terrifying at the time, but also completely enticing. And, then for me, slowly but surely, the idea of being able to create music with other people in collaboration that was hugely communicative and rich in dialogue and meaning, a meaning that can't be expressed in words, but that really is about just expressing or commenting on feeling and being. That's really sort of just propelled me continually to keep trying and keep exploring in that realm. So I don't really know if that answers your question and how Australian that is.
As you're talking, we talk about this notion, maybe it's too pat, but this notion of space, and certainly Australia, we're all also used to space. And you, Andrea, use space so well in your music, you know, and you're not afraid of it, you know, and I think that's, you know, maybe that's a totally different sort of use of or takes on space. But I'm interested in this idea of audiences as well. And certainly one thing that was written about the London or the new British jazz community was the fact that that these musicians were seeing, or people would come and see these musicians that looked like them on stage. So you got a lot of women, a lot of Black British kids coming to watch jazz. And two, that it became a kind of sense around experience. You know, you had somebody improvising and being corralled by the audience, you know, and it became very much a sort of club kind of environment. Maybe Hadley, you might want to take that one on. You know, have you seen that there's a different way that audiences are listening to jazz in Australia or experiencing jazz in Australia?
Yeah, I think definitely. I think there's still very much a strong kind of audience and market for, I don't know, a more kind of traditional concert hall format, and definitely jazz clubs are doing particularly well at the moment, as Andrea said. So I think that audience is still very much there, but at the same time, particularly with the younger kind of demographic, we're seeing more and more gigs in, especially cross-genre kind of jazz collaborations happening in nightclubs, in bars, in more unexpected and non-traditional spaces. And now we're allowed to dance again in Melbourne. A lot of dancing has come back into the fray as well. Lo and behold, no, it's really encouraging, and I think it's really, I mean, with very much with my festival hat on, it's fabulous to go out on a Wednesday night in one of the sort of trendier suburbs here in Melbourne and see a whole load of under 30s out, and you pack to the door, which is a world I'm sure the rest of the world can only dream of at the moment. But and listening to jazz or a version of jazz, and I think it's exciting that we've got that breadth. Really,
I think jazz is having a moment, absolutely, yeah. And and Jeremy, what about you? Have you seen audiences? I mean, you must play in different guises to lots of different audiences.
That's right, yeah. I think there's just in general a renewed appetite for live music, for live performance. It's interesting that when the COVID restrictions were a little stricter here, people were forced to book and check in early, and that's kind of continued, even though it's eased, which is great to see. Often you wouldn't know how the audience numbers were going until the day, but I think that's indicative of how excited people are of getting out and supporting music. That being said, there was some of the venues have unfortunately had to close just because I guess there was some debt, overhanging debt due to the lockdown, which was very unfortunate. But in general, the audiences so far have been really great. And actually, I'm about to embark on an East Coast tour next month, so I can let you know how that goes. I'm really excited to get back to more regional audiences as well as.
That's you as a solo artist, or with your quartet, or?
That's with my collaborative group, the Vampires.
Fantastic. What about you, Andrea? What's next for you?
I started a few new bands this year. I didn't intend to, but I'd been dreaming about them in lockdown. So they've eventuated, and they'll both be recording this year. And I've got a couple of commissions too that I'm quite excited about. So a little bit of interstate touring, a few little trips. A bit of everything. Things are slowly returning.
Right, and Hadley, you're getting ready. Are there going to be any international tips for the international artists coming down? Or we don't really need them because Australian jazz is so fantastic.
Well, yeah, that's right. We've actually had quite a handful of international artists hiding out here over the last 12 months, so we will probably see some of them in the festival. But as I said before, we're just excited to really get behind the local scene for this year in particular. And because there's so much new work that's come out of the last 12 months, and as Andrea was just saying, so there's a lot of new commissions and new projects and album launches. We're full steam ahead for our festival in October.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's all we've got time for. Thank you so much for listening to this panel on Australian jazz. I'd like to thank Andrea Keller, Jeremy Rose, I'm going down now, and Hadley Agrez. I think we're all agreeing that Australian jazz is in rude health, and we'll see you somewhere jazzy very soon.